afternoon, students, and welcome to today's lecture on sport in the Etruscan world. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we sail west from the rocky shores of ancient Greece to the wild world of the Italian peninsula. In doing so, we begin our transition from the world of ancient Greek sport to the realm of ancient Roman spectacle. But before we get to the vicious gladiatorial battles in the Colosseum, we first need to go back in time, about 700 years. So long before Rome became the eternal city, ruling the Mediterranean. And even before it was the preeminent city on the Italian peninsula, it was one small culture among a vast array of tribes in ancient Italy. And first among those tribes, in power and in wealth, and of course in sport and spectacle, were the mighty Etruscans. So whether you're looking to read the omens of the gods or simply looking for some tomb decoration ideas, journey with me as we investigate sport and spectacle in the Etruscan world. Alright, so as always, let's begin by setting the scene. It's the early years of the 8th century BCE, the 700s BCE, and two twin babies by the names of Romulus and Remus have just been put in a reed basket and floated down the Tiber River. Now in the shallows near a bend in the river, they wash ashore, and there a she-wolf, or a lupa in Latin, rescues them and suckles them, and then afterwards a nearby farmer begins to raise them as his own children. Once they're grown, Romulus and Remus head home to avenge their grandfather, and thereupon head back to that very same bend in the river to found their own city, Rome, in the year 753 BCE. So according to legend, right, Rome was founded in 753 BCE, and somewhat amazingly, archaeological evidence on the Palatine Hill in Rome kind of sort of confirms this 8th century foundation date. We even have something called the Hut of Romulus. But what else was going on when these two brothers set out to build the Eternal City? Well, back in the early part of the first millennium BCE, Italy was full of a diverse group of tribes. Some lived in the mountains, the Apennines in central Italy. Some stuck to the coasts along the Tyrrhenian and the Adriatic seas. And some inhabited the fertile plains of central Italy. And it was there, in modern-day Tuscany, just north of Rome, that the Etruscans, the most powerful of Italy's early tribes, rose to power in the years close to the founding of Rome. Now, we can get a sense for the wealth and power of the Etruscans from the archaeological remains they've left behind. We can see incredibly sophisticated bronze armor, adopted in large part from Greek styles of armor at that same time. And we can see remarkably detailed bronze sculptures like the Chimera of Arezzo that we see over here, right? We've got a mythological beast with the body of a lion, the tail of a snake, and a goat's head sticking out of its back. And we can see impressively decorated pottery, both imported from the Greek mainland and created locally using Greek techniques. And we can see soaring temples, right? With Greek-like columns in the front, but also kind of a uniquely Etruscan take on rooftop sculpture. We have these terracotta sculptures of the gods walking along the crest of the roof. And we even see Etruscan inscriptions above the tombs of the deceased, written in the Etruscan language, but using the Greek alphabet. So by now you probably get the point, right? The Etruscans strongly interacted with and were influenced by the ancient Greeks. Now, politically and religiously, they had similarities as well. Each city was independently owned and operated, kind of a city-state model, right? Just like in Greece, which meant that the citizens of different Etruscan cities shared a culture, and they shared a language, and they shared a religion, but also that they were often at war with each other, and they competed against other city-states. Religiously, the Etruscans had their own pantheon of gods, very closely linked to nature, and they emphasized the strong connection to nature and illuminating the will of the gods through divination and augury. And we even have this amazing bronze diagram of a sheep's liver with an Etruscan inscription that details how to interpret different parts of the liver to understand the will of the gods. That's the process of divination, kind of looking at things in nature to understand what the gods want you to do. And this is like an ancient textbook showing you exactly how to do that with the sheep's liver. Very, very cool stuff here. Alright, so the Etruscans were the most powerful group in northern Italy for at least 2 or 3 centuries after the founding of Rome. But despite their power and importance in the middle of the first millennium BCE, we have an awfully difficult time really understanding their culture. And this is for 2 main reasons here, right? So first, we have a lot of texts about the Etruscans, but they're almost all written by Greeks and Romans, so not by the Etruscans themselves. So we get a pretty skewed perspective on their practices and their culture. And second, while we have tons of iconographic images produced by the Etruscans, especially concerning sport and spectacle, we don't have any texts to go along with them. So they're great for creating lots of potential interpretations, but it's tough to lock down kind of the quote-unquote right interpretation with any certainty. Moreover, when we get an Etruscan vase that's made locally but it's modeled on Greek artistic motifs, it's kind of difficult to tell whether the depictions of sport on those vases are kind of depicting the Etruscan reality, or they're simply an adoption of Greek artistic tropes that would have been popular in the Greek mainland. The earliest archaeological evidence for sport for the Etruscans comes in the form of pottery and statuettes, and these show boxing and wrestling, the same sorts of combat sports that we get in Bronze Age cultures like Minoan Crete and ancient Egypt. Only slightly later we get our first evidence of horse racing from the terracotta panels at the Etruscan palace of Merlot. Now, later Roman historians also comment on the Etruscan games in the earliest days. And Livy says that Tarquin the Elder, the first Etruscan king of Rome and the 5th king overall, he elevated sport and spectacle to an entirely new level, holding boxing and horse racing and the newly founded Circus Maximus. But you have to keep in mind that Livy was writing something like 600 years after the time he's talking about. That'd be like me writing a history about the arrival of Christopher Columbus, right? Really, really big time gap there. Now, probably the single most important type of evidence for Etruscan sport comes from tomb paintings. Now, Etruscan tombs, these things are awesome, right? They're usually built above the ground, and they take the form of like little mounds, and we call these tumuli. And honestly, they look a lot like hobbit holes. And inside the tombs, they were modeled on houses, very literally a house for the dead. And they were decorated with bright, elaborate pictures, frescoes of celebrations and of daily life. And most importantly for our purposes, depictions of sport and spectacle. Now, the site of Tarquinia, not too far north and west of Rome, is particularly important for our understanding of early Etruscan sport. So over here, we can see the tomb of the augurs at Tarquinia and dating to around 540 or 530 BCE. So let's take a look at the tomb paintings here, and we'll start with the augurs themselves, the people who give the name to the tomb. Now, an augur is a person whose job it is to divine or understand the will of the gods. And over here, we can see 2 of those augurs. They're clothed characters, and one of them's holding a curved staff, known as a lituus in Latin. And that's one of the things often used in the process of augury or divination. And he's pointing at 2 flying birds, which were also another way that people tried to figure out the will of the gods, by the flight paths of birds. Now, to the right of the augurs are 2 nude wrestlers, showcasing at least one clear depiction of sport. Although scholars argue that these wrestlers, well, they're not necessarily aristocratic Etruscans participating in sport for the sake of competition. Rather, they're slaves putting on a spectacle for aristocratic Etruscans to watch. Now finally, at the far right-hand side of the image, we get the most interesting thing here, right? We get a masked figure with the title of Fair Suit written next to him. And he's leading a dog by the leash. And that dog just happens to be eating a bound captive. Now scholars call this the Fair Suit game. And just about every archaeologist has their own interpretation of what's going on here. So some say we're seeing the origin of the gladiatorial games. Others argue that it's damnatio ad bestias, or the execution by beasts. Still others call this part of some sort of weird foot race, and I really honestly have no idea how they're getting that there. But still others call this a sacred recreation of Heracles' labor when he had to capture Cerberus from down in Hades. Still other scholars think that we're looking at part of an initiation ritual, part of the rites associated with a mystery religious cult. So to sum up here, right, it's either a staged combat, or a contest, or a performance, or an execution, or a dramatic production, or an initiatory rite. I hope this gives you a sense for what I mean when I say it's tough to interpret with any degree of certainty what's going on when all we have are images. We're really all over the place here. Now the Tomb of the Augurs isn't the only tomb at Tarquinia that provides evidence of Etruscan sport. The Tomb of the Inscriptions, also dating to just before 500 BCE, also shows wrestling scenes as well as boxing scenes, again confirming their presence in early Etruscan culture. And the Tomb of the Olympics from around the same time shows people engaged in classic Greek-style sport. So for instance, we have 3 runners engaged in a foot race, and a nude discus thrower just like the Discobolus, and a jumper as well. Other images from the Tomb of the Olympics include boxing and chariot racing, also events found at the traditional Olympic Games. Now the Tomb of the Monkey at the site of Chiusi, that also shows nude athletes. So we have boxers, a javelin thrower, wrestlers, and a chariot race. In much the same way that you might imagine that Greek athletes were depicted in classical Greek art. So it would appear that even if Greek-style sport was not a native Etruscan development, it was adopted at least to some extent in the same way that the Etruscans adopted the Greek alphabet, Greek styles of armor, that sort of thing. Now the Tomb of the Chariots, which dates to the early 400s BCE, gives us a sense for both Etruscan sporting events and for the spectators that watch those events. So we can see both boxing and wrestling here, just like in other tombs. But we also get images of the spectators, right? And this is part of what makes it spectacle. And here we see aristocratic Etruscans clothed in very fine garb, sitting under covered bleachers, while lower status people, perhaps even slaves, stand underneath the bleachers to watch the games. We can also see from these paintings that aristocratic women could indeed attend the games. So you remember back how at the Olympics, you got thrown off a cliff if you were a married woman and showed up at the games? Not so in Etruria. So the tomb suggests that women, at least aristocratic women, could indeed attend the games just like the men. So what do we get when all this pictorial evidence from Etruscan tombs is added up? Like what sort of sporting events do we have? Well, there are plenty of examples of both boxing and chariot racing. And although some scholars argue that chariot racing was borrowed from the Greeks, others point to the fact that you only get 2- and 3-horse chariots in Etruscan culture, and that it may have been an independent development just to the native Etruscans. And that's because you normally have 4-horse chariot races in Greek culture. And this certainly isn't impossible, this independent development. So for example, right, we have a uniquely Etruscan horse race, where horsemen dismounted acrobatically, and then somehow combined kind of both the process of horse racing and foot racing into a single event, a uniquely Etruscan thing. Now regardless of whether chariot racing was developed independently or borrowed from the Greeks, we definitely have evidence of Greek-style sport. So all 5 of the pentathlon events are in fact evidenced. We have running and jumping and throwing the discus and throwing the javelin and wrestling as well. But scholars still argue about whether the presence of these events meant that the Etruscans had an actual similar pentathlon, a group of 5 events put together. And they debate that because all 5 events, they're not found together in the same piece of art. So some argue that no, it didn't happen, these are just individual events. Others argue, though, that it's very, very rare for those 5 events to be depicted together, even in ancient Greece, who we know did have the pentathlon. So it's kind of something that hasn't quite been resolved, and it's not really clear whether the Etruscans found these as individual events or put them all together in a pentathlon just like the Greeks. In sum then, right, what we get with Etruscan athletic events and spectacle, it's a combination of Greek-inspired sports with things like the discus and the javelin, along with things that might be Greek or perhaps independently developed, so things like chariot racing and wrestling and boxing. And those are put alongside things that are definitely unique to the Etruscan world, like that super weird Fairsu game that we were talking about earlier, where the masked man leads a beast like a dog, right, to attack a bound captive. Alright, so we've seen earlier in this course the role of athletes within ancient Greek society. Aristocratic boys and men all participated in sport and athletics. And elite athletes in the Greek world would often win glory both for themselves and for their home city-states. And the best of the best, the Michael Jordans and LeBron Jameses and Rob Steffens of the Greek world, they would become veritable heroes, imbued with special powers after their death, and the focus of worship and veneration from the surrounding community. Now in the Etruscan world, things seem to be a little different. So rather than being from the aristocratic elite class, Etruscan athletes appear to come from the lower classes, perhaps using sport and spectacle as their ticket to a lucrative livelihood. Now how do we know this? In part, it's from Roman authors who comment on the Etruscan games. So Livy, writing in the 1st century BCE, says that the king of the Etruscan city-state of Veii threatened to withdraw his performers from one set of games, indicating that most of these performers were indeed his very own slaves. Now this isn't to say that all athletes were slaves, but it does seem that some were, and it is evidence that against kind of Etruscan sport being a primarily aristocratic endeavor for the athletes themselves. Because athletes weren't elite, it also meant that we tend to kind of know a little bit less about individual athletes in the Etruscan world than we do in the Greek world, right? So there's no real Etruscan equivalent to like Milo of Croton or Theagenes of Thasos, for example. In a very, very small number of instances, we do get the names of some athletes. So back to the Tomb of the Augurs, right, at Tarquinia, we do have the names there. And the names scrawled next to those wrestlers are Tetu versus Latite. Okay, so overall, the athletes, or the status of the athletes, seems to be one of the most important aspects that differentiates Etruscan sport from Greek sport. In Etruria, athletes seem to be from the lower classes, or they were slaves. In Greece, athletes come from a variety of socioeconomic levels, but many of them tend to be elites, especially the ones who kind of participate at the highest level of Greek sport at those Panhellenic Games. They tend to come from elite, wealthy, aristocratic families. Now it's too bad that there wasn't a battle of the classes here, right? So you have the aristocratic Greeks versus the kind of lower class Etruscans, rich versus poor, to see who would triumph in the wide world of ancient Mediterranean sport. I would have liked to watch that. Now, whereas Greek sport in the classical period was frequently associated with religion and with the celebration of the pantheon of the Greek gods, so like Zeus and Apollo and Poseidon and Athena and Artemis, they all had their own fair share of games. Etruscan sport harkens back to where we see the origin of ancient Greek sport, so namely the realm of funeral games. So for Greek sport, we see this described in writing, very specifically, right? Homer's Iliad and the funeral games of Patroclus. In Etruscan sport, we make this connection with the funerary realm based on the context where evidence for sport is found. So almost all representations of Etruscan sport come from the funerary realm. We get frescoes inside of Etruscan tombs that show both athletic events and wealthy aristocrats watching those events. And we also get grave markers and grave goods, things like ceramic vases, that depict similar athletic events. Now, using this iconographic evidence, archaeologists have begun to put together the funerary rituals for the Etruscans. Now these rituals would take place in 4 steps. It would begin with the prothesis, or the laying out of the body, which would then be followed by a banquet or a feast. That feast would then be followed by athletic games, and then finally everything would conclude with shows such as dancing or dramatic plays. And some archaeologists have even argued that the tombs themselves are modeled on the tents under which Etruscan elites would have watched the games, right? So by burying the deceased in a tomb that's modeled on a tent that would be used for watching the games, the deceased forevermore, for all of eternity, gets to kind of lay there and watch the events play out in a fresco form upon the wall for all of eternity. Now, while the funerary realm might have been the most common venue for Etruscan sport, we do get at least some evidence for kind of like Pan-Hellenic style sport between Etruscan city-states. Now, our best evidence for this is an inscription known as the Rescripto di Spello, and it talks of a series of games at the sanctuary of Voltumna, near the Etruscan town of Volsini. Now, fun fact here, right? This town is often associated with the modern town of Orvieto, which is where the University of Arizona runs its study abroad program. And recently, they found what they think is indeed the actual sanctuary of Voltumna where these games would have taken place. Anyway, it was here that the 12 most powerful Etruscan city-states gathered to compete in a variety of contests. We definitely know there were plays, and we definitely know there were combat sports. And there may also have been musical contests and gymnic sports like running and throwing as well. This likely all came to a close after the Romans besieged the town of Volsini in 264 BCE, bringing Roman dominance over the Etruscans and then moving that population to a different part of the Etruscan world. Alright, so time for past meets present today. And for today's lecture on Etruscan sports, this is kind of a tough one. So funeral games don't really stand out in the modern world the same way they did in the ancient Etruscan world. And so perhaps it's better to think of a parallel in kind of another sort of way. In the ancient Greek world, sport was kind of in large part about the athlete, right? About the person participating in the sport. It's centered on the competitors themselves. In the ancient Etruscan world, sport was in large part about the spectators. And depictions of Etruscan sports suggest that sport was a kind of very important way to entertain elite Etruscan spectators rather than something to be valued simply for the sake of competition itself, kind of more like what we get in the Greek world. Now that conception of sport as a form of entertainment for spectators, that's perhaps far more in line with the way that we approach sport in the modern world. So to some extent, right, all the major sports leagues, the NBA, the NFL, MLB, NHL, right, those all exist for the fans. And you take away the thousands of live spectators and the millions of TV spectators, and all those leagues would disappear almost overnight. Now, there is a big difference here, right? Modern pros in those leagues, they aren't at the bottom of today's socioeconomic spectrum, right? They're in the top 1% of the 1% in terms of income. And their celebrity status rivals actors and singers and politicians. Now, in some ways, Etruscan sport might be most closely related then to something like college basketball or college football. And while these stars of the NCAA do indeed gain fame and the potential to make money down the road, the athletes participating in college revenue-generating sports often make startlingly little compared to the money they generate for those who put on the show. So in addition to tuition, a college football star might make $20,000 or $30,000 a year to cover food and lodging and books, kind of things of that nature, right? The cost of living. Compare that with football bowl game executives. So we've got this guy, Jim McVeigh. He's the president of the Outback Bowl, right? A single bowl game a year. And he makes over $1 million a year just for putting on that one bowl game. And it's not even that good of a bowl, right? We're not talking about one of the playoff games here. So we have the person in charge making over $1 million a year for serving as a figurehead. And we have the people playing the game forbidden to earn a fair market wage for their efforts. So perhaps kind of some sort of parallel to the Etruscan world. Now, this parallel might not be perfect, but those revenue-generating college sports do start to hint at least at kind of the power differentials that exist between athlete and spectator or between athlete and organizer that serve at the core of ancient Etruscan sport and spectacle. Alright, you have made it to the end of another episode. Now today we've switched cultures and begun to investigate the wide world of Etruscan sport. And in some ways, this is incredibly reminiscent of Greek sport, right? With events like wrestling and boxing and the discus and the javelin and chariot racing, right? Those are all Greek things. But in other ways, Etruscan sport is completely different. So rather than being a venue for competition between aristocratic athletes, Etruscan sport was for aristocratic spectators who watched lower class athletes compete. Moreover, far more of this competition took place within the funerary realm, right, as funeral games for the deceased, compared to what we see in classical Greece, right, with games oriented towards the traditional Greek gods at Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries like Olympia and Delphi and Isthmia and Nemea. And these differences foreshadow sport and spectacle in the Roman world, where once again the focus is placed on the host and the spectator rather than the athletes themselves. So if you're looking to just sit back, relax, and watch your favorite sporting event on television, know that you would have made a great Etruscan aristocrat. Just a couple lessons you can learn from sport and spectacle in the Etruscan world.